The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Fallujah as Marine Sergeant Sarah Martinez adjusted her Kevlar helmet and checked her rifle one final time. At 24 years old, she had already completed 2 tours in Iraq, but something felt different about this mission. The intelligence reports had been conflicting, and the usual chatter from local informants had gone eerily silent over the past 3 days. Sarah's unit, a small convoy of 4 vehicles, was tasked with delivering medical supplies to a remote outpost 15 miles outside the city. It should have been a routine mission, the kind they had completed dozens of times before. But as they rolled through the narrow streets lined with concrete barriers and abandoned buildings, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The convoy commander, Captain Rodriguez, had chosen the route carefully, avoiding the main roads where improvised explosive devices were commonly planted. They took a winding path through residential neighborhoods, past children playing in dusty courtyards and women hanging laundry on rooftops. The locals barely looked up as the armored vehicles passed, a sign that had learned to live with the constant presence of military patrols. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of the second vehicle, scanning the windows and rooftops through her scope. Her driver, Corporal Johnson, hummed nervously under his breath, a habit he had developed during their first deployment together. Behind them, 2 more vehicles followed at a safe distance, their gunners alert and ready. As they approached a T intersection, near an old mosque, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The street vendors who usually crowded this busy corner were nowhere to be seen. The tea shops that normally bustled with activity stood empty, their metal shutters pulled down tight. Even the stray dogs that typically roamed these streets had vanished. She grabbed her radio and was about to warn Captain Rodriguez when the world exploded around them. The lead vehicle disappeared in a massive fireball as a roadside bomb detonated with devastating force. The shockwave hit Sarah's vehicle like a giant fist, shattering windows and sending metal fragments flying through the air. Before she could process what was happening, muzzle flashes erupted from windows and rooftops on both sides of the street. The distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles filled the air as insurgents opened fire from carefully prepared positions. It was a classic ambush, perfectly timed and expertly executed. Corporal Johnson slammed on the brakes and tried to reverse, but Sarah could see insurgents emerging from buildings behind them, cutting off their escape route. They were trapped in a kill zone with nowhere to run and no cover except their damaged vehicles. The radio crackled with desperate voices as the surviving members of the convoy tried to coordinate their defense. Captain Rodriguez's voice was absent from the chatter, and Sarah realized with growing horror that the lead vehicle had taken the full force of the explosion. The third and fourth vehicles were returning fire, but they were vastly outnumbered and surrounded. Sarah kicked open her door and rolled out onto the street, her training taking over despite the chaos around her. Bullets whined overhead as she low-crawled to a position behind the engine block, the only part of the vehicle that might stop rifle rounds. She could see muzzle flashes coming from at least a dozen different positions, and more insurgents were arriving every minute. The battle that followed would test everything Sarah had learned in her years of training and combat experience. But nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen next, or the incredible journey of survival that would push her beyond every limit she thought she had. The firefight erupted with savage intensity as Sarah found herself pinned behind the twisted wreckage of her vehicle. The insurgents had planned this ambush perfectly, using the narrow streets and multi-story buildings to create overlapping fields of fire that left the Marines with almost no room to maneuver. Sarah's rifle barked repeatedly as she engaged targets moving between buildings. Her marksmanship training served her well, but for every insurgent she dropped, 2 more seemed to take his place. The enemy fighters moved with practiced efficiency, using doorways and windows to pop up, fire a few rounds, and disappear before return fire could find them. Corporal Johnson had taken shrapnel in his leg from the initial explosion, but continued to fight from behind the rear tire. His M249 squad automatic weapon chattered steadily, sending bursts of suppressive fire toward the rooftops where snipers had taken position. The heavy machine gun from the third vehicle added its voice to the battle, but Sarah could hear the rate of fire slowing as ammunition began to run low. The radio traffic told a grim story. Half the convoy was dead or seriously wounded, and the survivors were running out of ammunition fast. Captain Rodriguez was confirmed dead, along with his entire crew. The fourth vehicle had taken a rocket-propelled grenade hit and was burning fiercely, black smoke billowing into the desert sky. Sarah realized they needed to move or die. Staying pinned in the kill zone would only lead to their inevitable destruction as the insurgents closed in from all sides. She grabbed her radio and tried to coordinate with the remaining vehicles. But the static-filled responses told her that their communications were being jammed. A new sound joined the battle as mortars began falling around their position. The insurgents had brought heavy weapons to ensure no one escaped their trap. Sarah watched in horror as the building next to them collapsed in a shower of concrete and dust, the result of a direct mortar hit. That was when she made the decision that would save her life but nearly cost her everything. Sarah spotted an alley between two buildings that seemed to offer the only possible escape route. If she could reach it and work her way around behind the insurgent positions, she might be able to call in accurate artillery strikes on their coordinates. She grabbed every piece of ammunition she could carry and sprinted toward the alley as bullets kicked up dust around her feet. A burning sensation across her shoulder told her that at least one round had found its mark, but adrenaline kept her moving. Behind her, Johnson's machine gun roared as he provided covering fire, knowing he was sacrificing himself to give her a chance. The alley was narrow and filled with debris, but it offered concealment from the main firefight. Sarah pressed herself against a bullet-scarred wall and tried to catch her breath while blood seeped through her uniform from the shoulder wound. She could hear the battle raging behind her, the volume of friendly fire decreasing with each passing minute. Using hand signals she had learned in urban warfare training, Sarah began working her way through the maze of back alleys and bombed-out buildings. Her goal was to reach a radio antenna she had spotted on a tall building several blocks away, where she hoped to establish communication with coalition forces and call for immediate support. But the insurgents had anticipated this move. As Sarah emerged from behind a pile of rubble, she found herself face-to-face with 3 fighters who had been waiting in ambush. The first rounds hit her before she could even raise her weapon, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the ground in a spray of blood and concrete dust. Pain exploded through Sarah's body as the first 3 rounds slammed into her chest and abdomen. Her body armor absorbed some of the impact, but the close-range shots still felt like sledgehammer blows that drove the air from her lungs and sent her tumbling backward into a pile of concrete blocks. The insurgents moved closer, confident they had eliminated another American soldier. But Sarah's training had taught her to fight until her last breath, and somewhere deep inside a voice was screaming at her to survive. As the fighters approached to confirm their kill, Sarah managed to draw her sidearm with trembling hands. Her first shot caught the nearest insurgent center mass, dropping him instantly. The other 2 fighters scattered for cover, but not before Sarah had wounded a second man with a shot to the leg. The brief firefight that followed was desperate and chaotic, fought at point-blank range among the rubble and debris of the destroyed neighborhood. When the shooting stopped, Sarah found herself alone but riddled with bullet wounds. The insurgents' AK-47 rounds had found their mark repeatedly, and she could feel warm blood pooling beneath her body. Her tactical vest had stopped several rounds, but others had found gaps in her protection, tearing through muscle and bone with devastating effect. Sarah tried to count her wounds but kept losing track as shock began to set in. Her left arm was shattered, hanging useless at her side. Multiple rounds had punched through her legs, and she could feel at least 3 more wounds in her torso. Blood loss was making her dizzy, and she knew she had minutes, not hours, before she lost consciousness permanently. But giving up was not in Sarah Martinez's vocabulary. Drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, she began crawling toward what remained of a bombed-out apartment building. Every movement sent waves of agony through her broken body, but she forced herself to keep going, leaving a trail of blood on the dusty ground behind her. The building offered concealment, but little comfort. Sarah found a corner where fallen concrete beams created a small shelter, just big enough for her to hide while she tried to treat her wounds. Her first aid kit had been damaged in the fighting, but she managed to salvage some field dressings and began the grim task of stopping the bleeding. The reality of her situation became clear as she worked. 18 separate bullet wounds had turned her body into a map of trauma and pain. Some were through-and-through shots that had missed vital organs, but others were more serious. A round had nicked her femoral artery, and despite her best efforts with a tourniquet, she was still losing blood at an alarming rate. Sarah's radio had been destroyed in the fighting, along with any hope of calling for immediate rescue. She could hear vehicles moving in the distance and occasional bursts of gunfire, but whether they belonged to friend or foe was impossible to determine. The insurgents were searching the area systematically, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they found her hiding place. As darkness began to fall over Fallujah, Sarah faced the most difficult night of her life. Fever from infection was already setting in, and delirium came in waves that made it hard to distinguish between reality and nightmare. She clutched her pistol with her one good hand, determined to take some of her enemies with her if they discovered her location. The sounds of the city at night were a symphony of terror. Distant explosions, the rattle of automatic weapons, and the wailing of sirens created an atmosphere of constant danger. Sarah knew that coalition forces would eventually mount a rescue operation, but she also knew that standard procedure called for a 24 to 48-hour wait before sending troops into such a dangerous area. She would have to survive on willpower alone until help arrived, fighting against blood loss, infection, and the growing certainty that she might die alone in this concrete tomb she had chosen as her final battlefield. The first night was an endless nightmare of pain and terror that tested every ounce of Sarah's mental and physical endurance. Fever raged through her broken body as infection began setting in around her multiple wounds. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes waking to find insurgents searching nearby buildings with flashlights and shouted commands in Arabic. Sarah forced herself to remain absolutely still during these terrifying moments, barely breathing as enemy fighters moved through the rubble just feet from her hiding place. Her pistol remained ready in her good hand, though she knew that firing it would give away her position and bring down overwhelming force upon her small shelter. As dawn broke over the destroyed neighborhood, Sarah assessed her deteriorating condition with growing alarm. Several of her wounds had reopened during the night, and fresh blood stained her improvised bandages. Her water supply was nearly gone, and she had not eaten anything in over 24 hours. Weakness was making even simple movements incredibly difficult. But Sarah's military training had taught her that survival often came down to making smart decisions under impossible circumstances. She began rationing her remaining water, taking only small sips when the thirst became unbearable. She also started a mental routine reciting her name, rank, and serial number to keep her mind sharp despite the fever and blood loss. The second day brought new horrors as the insurgents expanded their search pattern. Sarah could hear them systematically clearing buildings, sometimes using explosives to bring down walls and expose hidden spaces. The sound of their voices grew closer with each passing hour, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they reached her location. Around midday, Sarah's worst fears nearly came true when 3 fighters entered the ruins of her building. They moved carefully through the debris, calling out in Arabic and occasionally firing shots into dark corners to flush out any hiding coalition forces. Sarah pressed herself deeper into her concrete shelter, trying to become invisible among the shadows and rubble. One of the insurgents stopped just meters from her position, so close that Sarah could smell his cigarette smoke and hear him breathing heavily in the desert heat. For what seemed like an eternity, he stood there scanning the area while Sarah held her breath and prepared for what might be her final fight. A distant explosion finally drew the fighters away, and Sarah allowed herself to breathe again. But the close call had shown her just how precarious her situation had become. The insurgents were getting more thorough with each sweep, and her hiding place would not protect her much longer. That afternoon brought a new challenge as Sarah's condition continued to deteriorate. Hallucinations began mixing with reality as her brain struggled with blood loss and infection. She saw her family members calling out to her, urging her to hold on just a little longer. Sometimes she imagined she could hear helicopter rotors in the distance, only to realize it was the wind whistling through the bombed-out buildings. The second night was even worse than the first. Sarah's fever spiked to dangerous levels, and she found herself shivering uncontrollably despite the desert heat. Her wounds throbbed with every heartbeat, and she could feel infection spreading through her bloodstream like poison. But even in her delirium, Sarah held on to one unshakable belief: help was coming. Somewhere out there, her fellow Marines were planning a rescue mission, and she just had to survive long enough for them to find her. This faith became her anchor as she fought against the darkness that threatened to claim her. As dawn approached on what would be her third day in hell, Sarah made a promise to herself and to the memory of her fallen comrades. No matter what happened, she would not give up. She would fight until her last breath, and she would make sure that her sacrifice meant something in the greater battle against those who sought to destroy everything she believed in. Dawn of the third day brought Sarah to the edge of death. Her pulse was weak and irregular, and she could barely lift her head from the concrete floor where she lay surrounded by her own blood. The infection had spread throughout her system, creating a constant burning sensation that made even breathing an act of supreme willpower. Sarah's water had run out completely the night before, and dehydration was adding another layer of misery to her already desperate situation. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her tongue felt like sandpaper in her mouth. She had stopped sweating hours ago, a dangerous sign that her body was shutting down its normal cooling mechanisms. But even as her physical condition deteriorated beyond imagination, Sarah's spirit refused to surrender. She continued her mental exercises, reciting the names of her fellow Marines who had died in the ambush, promising them that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. She thought about her family back home in Texas, drawing strength from memories of her younger brother's graduation and her mother's proud smile when Sarah had earned her Marine Corps insignia. Around mid-morning, Sarah heard something that made her think the fever had finally driven her completely insane. In the distance, barely audible over the ambient noise of the city, came the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors. But this was different from the hallucinations she had experienced before. The sound was too consistent, too real, and it was growing steadily louder. Sarah forced herself to focus, fighting through the fog of pain and delirium to listen more carefully. There were multiple aircraft, and they were flying in a tactical formation that suggested a combat mission. Her heart began to race as she realized that this might be the rescue operation she had been praying for. The helicopters passed overhead without stopping, and Sarah's hope began to fade once again. But then she heard something even more beautiful than the aircraft engines, the sound of American voices calling out in English. A rescue team was on the ground, and they were searching building by building through the neighborhood where her convoy had been ambushed. Sarah tried to call out, but her voice was nothing more than a hoarse whisper after 2 days without water. She attempted to fire her pistol to signal her location, but her hands were shaking too badly to aim properly, and she could not afford to waste her last few rounds if insurgents were still in the area. Instead, Sarah began the painful process of moving toward the entrance of her shelter. Every inch was agony as she dragged her broken body across the debris-covered floor, reopening wounds and leaving fresh bloodstains on the concrete. But the sound of friendly voices gave her strength she had thought was long gone. The voices were getting closer now, and Sarah could make out individual words being shouted in tactical radio protocol. Someone was calling for medics, and she heard references to casualty evacuation procedures. The rescue team was professional and thorough, exactly what she had expected from elite special operations forces. Sarah managed to position herself where she would be visible from the main entrance to the building, though she remained partially concealed in case insurgents were still watching the area. Her pistol lay ready beside her, and she prepared to identify herself as a friendly force when the searchers finally reached her location. The wait seemed to last forever, though it was probably only a few minutes. Sarah could hear boots crunching through rubble and debris as the rescue team methodically cleared each room and corridor. Their voices were calm and professional, but she could detect an undercurrent of urgency that told her they knew time was running out. When the first figure appeared in the doorway, backlit by the desert sun and wearing the distinctive gear of a Navy SEAL, Sarah thought she might be looking at an angel sent to carry her home. The warrior moved with practiced efficiency, his weapon raised and ready, scanning for threats while his eyes searched every shadow and hiding place. Sarah tried to speak but could only manage a weak gesture with her good hand. The SEAL saw the movement immediately and spun toward her position, his rifle trained on her location until he could determine whether she was friend or foe in the dangerous urban battlefield. The Navy SEAL who found Sarah later told her that he had never seen anything like what she had endured and survived. When his flashlight illuminated her position in that concrete tomb, he initially thought he was looking at a corpse. Blood covered almost every inch of her uniform, and her face was so pale from blood loss that she appeared to have already died from her wounds. But when Sarah managed to whisper Marine in response to his challenge, the SEAL immediately called for his team medic and began the complex process of keeping her alive long enough to reach proper medical care. The medic, a combat veteran with years of experience treating battlefield trauma, later admitted that he had never worked on someone with 18 separate gunshot wounds who was still conscious and coherent. The extraction itself became a race against time as Sarah's vital signs continued to deteriorate despite the medic's best efforts. The SEAL team had to clear a landing zone for the medical helicopter while fighting off insurgent attacks that seemed to come from every direction. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness during the firefight, sometimes waking to see muzzle flashes and tracer rounds streaking through the air above her stretcher. The helicopter ride to the combat hospital was a blur of medical procedures and urgent radio communications. Sarah could hear the flight medic calling ahead with her vital statistics and wound descriptions, painting a grim picture of her chances for survival. Multiple times during the flight, her heart rate dropped to dangerous levels, and the medical team had to use emergency procedures to keep her alive. At the hospital, Sarah underwent nearly 12 hours of surgery, as teams of doctors worked to repair the massive damage caused by 18 bullet wounds. They removed shrapnel from her organs, reconstructed shattered bones, and performed multiple blood transfusions to replace what she had lost during her ordeal. The surgical team later said it was like putting together a complex puzzle where half the pieces had been destroyed. The recovery process was long and painful, filled with setbacks and small victories that gradually built into something approaching normal life. Sarah spent months learning to walk again, regaining the use of her left arm and dealing with the psychological trauma of her experience. Physical therapy sessions pushed her to rediscover her limits, while counseling helped her process the survivor's guilt that came with being the only member of her convoy to make it home alive. But Sarah's story did not end with her physical recovery. The courage she had shown during those 2 days in Fallujah became legendary throughout the Marine Corps, inspiring a new generation of warriors who learned that the human spirit could overcome almost any obstacle. Her actions had allowed coalition forces to understand exactly what had happened during the ambush, leading to intelligence breakthroughs that prevented similar attacks and saved countless lives. Sarah eventually returned to active duty, though in a different capacity than before. She became an instructor at the Marine Corps' Urban Warfare School, sharing the hard-won lessons she had learned during her ordeal. Her students, many of them preparing for their own deployments to dangerous places around the world, listened with rapt attention as she taught them not just tactics and procedures, but the mental toughness required to survive when everything went wrong. Years later, Sarah would often reflect on those 2 days that changed her life forever. The physical scars had faded somewhat, but the memory of what she had endured remained as sharp as ever. She carried with her the names and faces of the Marines who had died in that Fallujah street, honoring their sacrifice by living each day with purpose and determination. The Navy SEALs who rescued her became lifelong friends, men who understood better than anyone what it meant to face death and refuse to surrender. They remained in contact long after their military service ended, bound together by the brotherhood that forms between warriors who have shared life and death moments in the crucible of combat. Sarah's story became a testament to the unbreakable spirit of the American military, proof that training, determination, and sheer force of will could overcome even the most desperate circumstances. She had survived 18 bullets and 2 days in hell, emerging not as a victim, but as a symbol of everything that made her fellow warriors proud to wear the uniform and serve their country in the most dangerous places on earth.